Sweet. Well, welcome for those of you joining in person and those of you who will be watching the recording of this later on. Thank you for your interest in this course on the book of Romans. My name is Matthew, and I'll get the privilege of leading this course over the next few weeks. I know. So I just wanted to get started by letting you know about a little bit about who I am. That way you have some idea of what's going on in my life as I will be speaking over the next few weeks. So I was born and raised in the suburbs of the Twin Cities in Minnesota in the United States. It's the northern central part of the United States. My family, while I was growing up, hopped between several different churches. So as a result, I knew a lot about the Bible and who Jesus was, but I didn't really have any personal, meaningful relationship with him. But when I was in third grade, my parents sent me to a summer Bible camp. And while I was there, my counselor told me about the need to make a personal decision to follow Jesus, that it's not simply enough to know a lot about Jesus, but we need to make the decision for ourselves that we want to be his follower. So that summer, I dedicated my life to Christ. After graduating high school, I attended Moody Bible Institute's former sister campus in Spokane, Washington, on kind of the far end of the United States. I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Studies in 2018, and it was during my time in Spokane that I met Jonathan Armstrong and started working with Aqueduct Project. After graduation, I served as an intern for a year at Camp Shamina, the camp where I grew up going and the camp where I dedicated my life to Christ. And I was offered a full-time position there, and I've been here ever since. During the last several years, I've also had the opportunity to take some graduate classes, and so I have graduated with a master's in theological studies with an emphasis in biblical counseling from um, Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm really excited for this course in particular. Romans is one of my favorite books of the Bible. It's a fascinating book. It's very dense theologically. It's 16 chapters, and every single one of them is full of rich information. You could quote the book of Romans for virtually any situation as you're talking about what the gospel is. And in general, here at camp, where I spend most of my time and most of my working time, our emphasis is on the gospel. Our emphasis is on the things that unite Christianity, the things that bring Christianity together. And I think Romans very beautifully outlines the core message of what the gospel is. And to that end, then it outlines the core message of what are the things, what are the theological truths that bring us together as Christians, as followers of Jesus? What are the things that unite us? The things that we ought to rally around. So, like I say, I'm particularly excited for this course for that reason, because I think Romans is a very inspiring book, inspiring for the idea of Christian unity, inspiring for the idea of digging deep into how wonderful of a Savior we have and the good things that He's done for us and what it means to be a follower of Christ. So yeah, so that's just a little bit about me. So some of the objectives for this course are these, that the students and participants will develop an understanding of the historical context and general outline of the Book of Romans. So understanding where the Book of Romans came from, why it was written, what context it was written in, that sort of thing, because those things help us to gain a better understanding of some of the pieces of what's going on in the book itself. Participants will grow in their understanding and knowledge of the theology of the Book of Romans. Participants will gain a better understanding of the various interpretive challenges in the Book of Romans and be equipped to consider some of the major options for understanding those challenges. So a lot of the course sessions we will be discussing major theological issues as opposed to looking at particularities. So we'll be looking at these are some major theological thoughts that help us to understand what Paul is doing here in the book of Romans. Here are different ways that different scholars, different historians, different theologians, different pastors will understand the book of Romans and understand these passages. Students will read through the full book of Romans, so our goal is to read through the full book of Romans throughout this course. participants will have the opportunity to grow in intimacy with Jesus through the study of the book of Romans. And really, I think this is one of the most important objectives of this course, is that throughout it we would grow in our love for Christ, we would grow in our love and appreciation for what He's done for us, and that we would be able to grow closer to Him as we learn more about what He says about us and what He says about Himself through the writing of Paul in the book of Romans. And finally, participants will have the opportunity to develop a deep appreciation for the book of Romans, which I think likely we all start with a deep appreciation of the book of Romans already. So I think that one, as a goal, is somewhat low-hanging fruit, to borrow the expression. Um, so then, just looking at the course schedule, over the next few weeks will be outline of the book of Romans, which we'll be discussing the outline of the book of Romans today. But today, we're going to be introducing the book of Romans and looking a little bit at the first few verses and what we gain from those verses as far as what Paul's purpose for writing was and who he was writing to and that sort of thing. And then finally, the syllabus just has a recommended reading list. It has several resources that I would recommend as particularly valuable as we're considering the book of Romans. Some of them are um, direct commentaries on the Book of Romans. Others of them are um, just works about some of the theological topics that come up in Romans that I have found particularly helpful. So just in general, as we're going through the class, it's going to be primarily lecture with some discussion intermixed, but I hope for it to be relatively informal. So if you have any questions or any thoughts that you want to share, feel free just to unmute your microphone and interrupt me as we're going through the course. And I think that would be fantastic. My goal is for this to be an enjoyable course. So feel free to, like I say, pop in with thoughts or questions or comments as we go through. Here we have Romans, Walking the Way with Paul. I chose that title for this course, Walking the Way with Paul, very intentionally. In the ancient days, in the early church, Christianity wasn't yet known as Christianity. Instead, it was simply known as the Way. I think alluding to and borrowing from Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Um, and so the idea here is that we're walking on the way with Paul. We're walking on this journey of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a follower of Christ with Paul as he outlines it. And specifically choosing the phrase walking the way with Paul because the book of Romans has been used very significantly for sharing the gospel and sharing what the way is. And we have often used the idea of the Romans road. As a simple tool for sharing the gospel. Essentially, the Romans Road is a outline of several verses from the book of Romans that walk through what the gospel is, alluding to the historical event of the nation of the Empire of Rome creating a roadway system. For us, though, we have the Romans Road as a method of sharing the gospel. So that's the title, Walking the Way with Paul. And today, like I say, we're going to be introducing the book of Romans, which is, I think, very valuable. First, we want to talk about just some of the impact of the book of Romans and what exactly the book of Romans means, why it is valuable to read, and some of the impact that it's had historically throughout the history of Christianity. So we're going to start with this gentleman here with this amazing haircut. This is Martin Luther, who lived from 1483 to 1546, and he is, for those of you who don't know, the father of the Protestant Reformation. And I think it's appropriate that we start with Martin Luther because today, as we are recording this lecture, it is October 31st, which in some cultures would be Halloween, but in others would be Reformation Day. It is the, I believe, 507th anniversary today of when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door at the Church of Wittenberg and thus sparked the Protestant Reformation. So we're going to start with him. And he was studying the book of Romans when he concluded that a person is justified by faith alone before God. Like I say, starting with him, we start to get the picture of the value of the book of Romans and how it has had a spiritual impact, because it was by reading the book of Romans and by studying the book of Romans that Martin Luther was convinced that there was something wrong, that there was something that needed to be done, that led him to do his work that, though he wouldn't know it at the time when he started, would spark the Protestant Reformation. Because beyond the role that it played in his theology, it also played a role in his personal salvation. So Romans proved to play a decisive role in his conversion. Um, So we read in Martin Luther's own words, I greatly long to understand Paul's epistle to the Romans, and nothing stood in the way but that one expression, the justice of God in Romans 1:17. Because I took that mean that justice whereby God is just and deals justly in punishing the unjust. My situation was that although an impeccable monk, I stood before God as a sinner troubled in conscience. I had no confidence that my merit would assuage him. Night and day I pondered until I saw the connection between the justice of God and the statement that the just shall live by faith. Then I grasped that the justice of God is the righteousness by which, through grace and sheer mercy, God justifies us through faith. Thereupon I felt myself to be reborn, to have gone through the open doors into paradise. The whole scripture took a new meaning, whereas before the justice of God had filled me with hate, now it became in to me inexpressibly sweet and greater love. This passage of Paul has become to me a gate to heaven. So Martin Luther is referring to Romans 1:17, where Paul is speaking. And in that passage, as he was reading that passage, at first when he would read it, he'd be filled with doubts, filled with fear, because of a older way he had of understanding that passage. But as he studied that passage more, as he looked into that passage more, he came to realize exactly what it means for God to be just, and what it means that the just are saved by faith. The just shall live by faith. And it was through that he adjusted his theology, he adjusted his way of thinking, sparking, like I say, the Protestant Reformation. Though, again, he would not know that would be the outcome at the time. In his preface to the book of Romans, in his translation of the Bible, Luther writes, with almost unbounded praise. This epistle is really the chief part of the New Testament. It's truly the purest gospel. It is worthy not only that every Christian should know it word for word by heart, but also that he should occupy himself with it every day as the bread for the soul. We can never read or ponder it too much, for the more we deal with it, the more precious it becomes to us and the better it tastes. So that just gives you an idea of how much Martin Luther valued the book of Romans. He says it's something that every Christian should have memorized, and we should consider it and read it and ponder it every single day. And he believed that the more we pondered it, the more deep we got into the book of Romans, the more precious it would become to us and the better it would taste to us. And I hope that's the goal of this course, that as we go through the book of Romans together, it will become more and more precious to us, and we will come to enjoy and love the book of Romans all the more. So back here, we have John Calvin. He was another early Protestant reformer, and is considered to be the father of Reformed theology. And he wrote this in the dedication to his commentary on the book of Romans. He says, there are extant on this epistle many commentaries by the ancients and many modern writers, and truly they could never have employed their labors in a better way. For when anyone understands this epistle, he has a passage opened to him to understanding the whole of Scripture. For John Calvin, he understood that the book of Romans was an incredibly valuable work, and because it is so seeped in theology, because it is so seeped in what the gospel is, walking through the good news of Jesus Christ in a theological way. He believed that by understanding the book of Romans, we would be better equipped to understand the entire Bible, better understand all the other epistles of the New Testament, understand what's going on in the Gospels, understand how we're supposed to apply the Old Testament in our lives today. So we see again that the book of Romans is an incredibly valuable work. Here we have John Wesley. He lived from 1703 to 1791, and he was similarly indebted to the Book of Romans in his life. In 1738, another great Christian leader came to faith through the inspired words of Paul's epistle to the Romans. And we are talking about John Wesley here in case you weren't tracking with that. On the evening of May 24th, John Wesley attended a meeting at Aldersgate Street in London, where the preface to Martin Luther's commentary on Romans was being read aloud, the preface that we read a few moments ago. John Wesley wrote these famous words in his journal shortly thereafter. He wrote, "About a quarter before 9, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through the faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did not, I felt that I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for salvation. An assurance was given to me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death." And then John Wesley and his younger brother Charles, the writer of countless loved hymns, were greatly used by God as evangelists and social reformers throughout England and America at that time. So again, you see how the Book of Romans was deeply impactful for some of the most influential people in Christian history. Frederick Goddard, who lived around the turn of the 1900s, was a French expositor of the Bible, and he wrote this: "Spiritual revival in the church will be connected to a deeper understanding of this book. The Book of Romans is the cathedral of the Christian faith." So he talks about how, as we come to understand the Book of Romans more and more, it will truly bring about spiritual revival. As we understand the Book of Romans, it will motivate our faith. It will shape our faith, and it will help us to essentially fall more in love with Christ, desiring to make him the center of our lives and our being. So again, we see that the Book of Romans is this powerful work. C.H. Dodd, living 1884 to 1973, wrote that Romans is the first great work of Christian theology. I would go even further. It's not only the first, but also the greatest work of Christian theology. No one in 2,000 years has written anything to match it. Augustine of Hippo, going back much earlier in history, living in 354 to 430 AD, is one of the most influential fathers of the early church, and he himself was also converted to faith in Christ upon reading Romans 13 through 14. In late July of 386 AD, Augustine of Hippo, then unconverted and a career-centered teacher of rhetoric, fell down weeping under a tree in a garden in Milan. He felt convicted of his unchaste lifestyle and longed for the peace of Christian asceticism, but feared that he would never be able to change. Suddenly, Augustine heard a voice and calling him to say, "Pick up and read." And Augustine's eyes lighted upon a copy of Paul's epistles on a nearby bench. He rushed over to the place where the book lay and read a verse from the book of Romans in silence. And the verse said this: "Put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires." Years later, reflecting on that incident, Augustine wrote this: "I neither wished nor needed to read further. At once, with the last words of this sentence, it was as if a light of relief from all anxiety flooded into my heart. All the shadowy doubt were dispelled." And at that point, Augustine converted to Christianity. And on that day, he became um, a follower of Jesus and would go on to become one of the greatest theologians in all of church history. So again, you see the book of Romans having a deep impact. Bruce Metzger said that he's a biblical scholar living up until 2007, so a more modern figure. He called the Book of Romans the Constitution of Universal Christianity, pointing again to the idea that it is the theology of the Book of Romans, the theology of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, around which all Christians from all backgrounds, all different denominations, all different walks of life can find their unity. So Romans is the constitution of universal Christianity. Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart remark that this letter is arguably the most influential book in Christian history and perhaps in Western civilization. They can say that because of the deep impact that Christianity has had on Western civilization. Um, And insofar as Christianity has had an impact, Romans has had a deep impact on Christianity and the shape of Christianity and what Christianity is. So the story that all of this paints then is that the book of Romans has had a deep and significant impact on Christian history, on theology and on personal devotion, and very tangibly on the history of the world. So the book of Romans is all that to be said, a very valuable resource to be studied. So then we get to jump into some introductory matters about the Book of Romans, exploring the questions of who wrote it, why was the Book of Romans written, what context was it written in, who was it written to. All of these things, all of these questions are valuable questions as we're considering understanding the Book of Romans, because they will help us to just better understand what's going on in the Book of Romans. Just like if you receive a letter in the mail from a friend versus you receive an email from a coworker, you'll read those two emails, these two messages very differently. And knowing the context of who sent it, why they sent it, helps you to understand helps you to understand the content. In the same way, understanding the background matters of the Book of Romans helps us to understand the Book of Romans itself. So we'll start with who. Who wrote the Book of Romans? The Pauline authorship, the authorship of the book of Romans by the Apostle Paul, is virtually undisputed. For any issue, any topic that you desire, you can find people who digress, people who have a differing opinion, largely because some people just like to cause a stir and cause a muck. But the vocabulary, the style, the logic, the theological development are consistent with his other epistles. Um, Paul dictated this letter to a secretary named um, Tertius, as we see in Romans 16:22, who was allowed to add his own greeting there. But by and large, the book of Romans was written and most scholars would agree that it was written by the Apostle Paul. So, yay, that was easy. There we go. So then we get to jump into the question of where. Where was Paul when he wrote the book of Romans? It appears to be clear that Paul was in Corinth at the time of writing the book of Romans on one of his missionary journeys. There are a couple of significant clues that lead to this conclusion. Um, and most of those clues appear in chapter 16 of the book of Romans. In this final chapter of Romans, Paul gives us a large list of names of those to whom he sends his greetings. And some of those people include Phoebe in Romans 16, 1 through 2. Phoebe was a Christian deaconess from a town very close to the book to the city of Corinth, and in fact, that neighboring town served as a port city to Corinth. And Phoebe was actually the one who carried the epistle from Paul to the addressees in Rome. So if she lived very close to Corinth, it would make sense that Paul was writing it while he was in Corinth. Romans 16:23, the first half. Gaius is mentioned here, and he is thought to be the leader of the Corinthian church whom Paul baptized and mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1:14. In 1 Corinthians 1:14, Paul lists a few people that he baptized there, Gaius being one of them. And some would identify him as the Corinthian named Titus Justus in Acts 18:7 through 8. So again, you have this figure who appears in Corinth, also being someone who sends his greetings as Paul is writing the book of Romans. And then later in that same verse, in 16:23b, you have a man named Erastus. And Paul tells us that Erastus sends his greetings. And Erastus is a man who served as the city treasurer or the city's director of public works. Um, a more sure identification of Erastus would be the Pauline associate from Corinth. We see him mentioned in Acts 19:22 and 2 Timothy 4:20. So this same figure, the same person is appearing in these different places. And he is likely from Corinth. He's probably to be identified as the director of public works, whose name is found inscribed on a stone in Corinth. This has come to be known as the Erastus stone and was discovered in 1929. It reads that Erastus, in return for a position of leadership, laid the pavement at his own expense. So you have this historical artifact, this piece of history that points to this man named Erastus, who had a prominent position in the government in the city of Corinth. And you have Paul in the book of Romans, in Second Timothy, in the book of Acts, mentioning this man named Erastus, who had this significant position in the city of Corinth. So all of this points, one, to the historicity of the book of Romans, to say that the people who are mentioned here are actually historically valid people. They're historically real people. This wasn't something that was made up. But it also points to the idea that as Paul was writing the book of Romans, he was very likely in the city of Corinth. So then that brings us to the time of writing. When was this written? Um, There's only truly one fixed point of chronology when we're considering Paul, and that's the proconsulship of Gallio from 51 to 52 AD. And during that time, during the proconsulship of Gallio, Paul happened to be in Corinth, as is recorded in Acts 18:12. And all the other dates that we have for the Apostle Paul's life and for the Apostle Paul's work kind of center around this event because it's this event where we have a mention of this man, Gallio, being the proconsul in the area of Corinth at a particular time. And we have outside sources with historical documentation pointing to a specific year. So we have a specific year that Gallio was the proconsul. And we have in the book of Acts a recording of where Paul was when Gallio was the proconsul. So then from there, we can go forward in Paul's life and backwards in Paul's life to kind of build a timeline for approximately what years Paul was doing what he was doing. And then as we consider that, then we have to consider, based on that time, fixed point in time, when might Paul have been writing the book of Romans? Well, actually, Paul tells us quite clearly. He doesn't give a specific year, but he tells us very clearly what he was doing when he was writing the book of Romans. He says this in Romans 15:23 through 25. He writes, but now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I have been longing for many years to visit you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I have enjoyed your company for a while. Now, however, I am on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. So Paul tells us that he is writing this at the time when he is in Corinth, on his way to Jerusalem, before he plans on going to Rome and then to Spain. So we have to. So then we have to consider the question: when was Paul in Corinth, planning to travel to Jerusalem and then to go on to Rome? The answer is fairly simple. The answer is 56. The answer is 56 AD, while wintering in Corinth at the end of his third missionary journey. And we read about this in Acts 22 through 3. And again, we believe that this lines up with Romans 15:25. So approximately the same time that the events of Acts 22 through 3 were happening, Paul was writing the book of Romans from Corinth. So it's kind of fun. Boom. So knowing who wrote it, where he was writing from, and when he wrote it are helpful. But now the question of why did he write it? And this is a bigger one. This is an easier one to attach to understanding why it might be valuable for understanding the book of Romans. On the one hand, the answer is fairly simple. Paul planned on visiting Rome and intended to partner with the church there to set up his new mission to Spain. Paul's missionary strategy had often been to set up a mission headquarters in a city and then do ministry in the surrounding regions. So he's sending ahead to Rome a blueprint of his gospel program, a blueprint of the gospel message that he intends to preach launching from the city of Rome. But Paul's epistle to the Romans is more than just an exposition of the gospel. Paul also detailed the relationships between the Jewish believing community and the Gentile believing community in Romans 9 through 11. And very interestingly, surprisingly few commentators are able to make sense of the presence of Romans 9 through 11 in this epistle. Many people would be apt to simply remove Romans 9 through 11, simply ignore Romans 9 through 11 altogether. And much of the book would still flow together. You'd have a very clear presentation of what the gospel is, with very clear application in Romans 12 and following. So Romans 9 through 11 reads differently than the other sections of the book that commentators have puzzled over how it fits in with the grander scheme. C.H. Dodd made the claim, for instance, that it was probably an old sermon that Paul slapped into the middle of the epistle. But explanations like this, the desire to remove it altogether from the book of Romans, they're unsatisfactory. We believe that the Bible is inspired by God, that all of the pieces came together and are together for particular reasons. And so we have to ask the question, how does Romans 9 through 11 fit? So that leads us to ask the question then, was there a situation in the Church of Rome that required Paul to address, especially the issue of the relationship between the Jewish and the Gentile Christians? Because that's what's going on in Romans 9 through 11. And to answer that question, the answer to that question would be yes, there certainly was an issue going on that Paul would have wanted to address. So the church in Rome had been present from the earliest times of the Christian era. We read in Acts 2:10 that visitors from Rome were present in Jerusalem at the first Pentecost after Jesus' death and resurrection. And Luke tells us that about 3,000 Jews converted at Peter's sermon at Pentecost in Acts 2:41. Probably a large portion of these 3,000 people were from the city of Rome. Um, so they would have become followers of Jesus that day, and then they would have returned to Rome and started to establish a church there. The Rufus, this is actually very interesting to me. The Rufus mentioned in Mark 15:21 as the son of the man compelled to carry the cross of Christ. May very well be the same Rufus whom Paul greets in Romans 16:13. Um, so the idea here is that in Mark 15:21, we read, "A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross." So you have Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross of Christ, and Mark, in writing his gospel, specifically mentions that Simon is the father of Alexander and Rufus. It's valuable to know that most scholars believe that the book of Mark was also written specifically to a Roman audience. And so you have to ask the question, well, why would Mark include the idea of Simon being the father of Alexander and Rufus? Usually, at that time, if you were going to identify someone, you'd identify them by who their father was, not by who their children are. So it makes sense to say Simon, the son of whoever his father was, instead of Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. So why does Mark add this? Likely because his audience knew Alexander and Rufus. They knew who Alexander and Rufus were. So if he's writing to Rome, then it would make sense that Rufus was living in Rome at the time. And then it adds to the idea that in Romans 16:13, when Paul says, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me too," that this Rufus is one and the same. This Rufus that Paul is asking to greet is the son of the man who carried the cross for Christ. Um, which again, that would all make sense. Simon that day, when Christ was being crucified, probably had interactions with Christ, might have seen him, might have known about some of the things he had been doing. But when he was forced to carry the cross, I'm sure that stirred in his heart. Seeing Christ broken the way he was, stirred in him in a very powerful way. He very likely became a follower of Christ that day. And shared that faith with his wife, with his children, who would go on to continue the work of being followers of Christ. And Rufus then, possibly Alexander, but Rufus for sure, would have made his way to become a prominent member of the Church of Rome because of his history, because of how he came to know Christ, because likely of the passion that he had for Christ based on his father's experiences. Yes. So all of that then is to say that the Church of Rome was likely founded very early on in Christian history. We're not sure when Simon possibly, but for sure Rufus made his way over to Rome. But the church was established very early on because by the time Paul's writing, the church is already established. It's already there. He wasn't the one that founded it. Someone else had brought Christianity to Rome before him. So we have this history of there being this Christian movement in Rome. But despite this, unlike most of the churches that Paul wrote to, Paul had never personally been to Rome. He didn't establish a church at Rome, and he had never even been there. We see this in Romans 1, 8 through 13, where he writes this. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. God, whom I serve in my spirit in my preaching the gospel of his Son, is my witness, how constantly I remember you in my prayers at all times. And I pray that now, at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles. So Christianity thrived in Rome from an early time, and part of this success can be attributed to the numerical strength of the Jewish community in Rome. As a messianic movement, we can reasonably expect that the earliest Christianity would thrive in places where the Jewish community was large, um, and Rome was one of those places. How large, though, was the Jewish community in Rome in the first century AD? There's literary evidence as well as archaeological evidence between Jewish catacombs and remnants of synagogues that point toward the conclusion that the Jewish community in Rome was quite large at this time. Peter Lamp, a professor of New Testament studies at Heidelberg University is the world's authority on this question by many regards, and he concludes that a reasonable estimate concerning the population of the Jewish community in Rome at the time that Paul wrote his epistle to the church ranges from about 15,000 to 60,000. Estimates of the total population of Rome are about 700,000 to a million. So the Jewish community probably represented between 1.5% to 8.5% of the total population of Rome, which might feel small, but it is actually quite substantial when you stop and think about it. Um, you also see this in AD 49. Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from the city of Rome in an event known as the Edict of Claudius. So it's written about that time in the life of Claudius, when the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them, the Jews, from Rome. And Tertullian derides the Romans for calling the Christians by the name Christian or Christianus, noting that they cannot even correctly pronounce the Greek name Christian. So Tertullian is a Christian, one of the fathers of the church, and he criticizes the Romans, saying they can't even pronounce the name that they're calling us. They can't even pronounce the word correctly, saying that they're using this word Christus to describe Christian or Christ follower. The idea here then is that as Christianity was spreading among the Jews, as Jews were coming back from Pentecost, telling others about this Jesus, telling others about how they have this newfound faith in Christ, there start to be disturbances over the coming years. Many Jews have issue with the idea that Jesus is the Messiah, and they start to riot. They start to cause disturbance in the city, which makes sense. We don't have historical record of this in the book of Acts, specifically about Rome, but we see in the book of Acts the reaction of many Jewish communities to the gospel message being exactly that. You see riots starting, you see riots forming, you see the people at odds with the Christians. And so, if in the midst of the Jewish community there are these riots that are starting, there are these challenges that are rising, there are disturbances, all in the name of this Christus, then you can see why the emperor would want to and be motivated to expel the Jews from the city of Rome. So I think all of that, again, just points to the notion and the idea that historically there were a large Jewish sect in Rome at the time, very early on. And in that group, Christianity started to spread pretty quickly. So the Jews were permitted to return to Rome upon the death of Claudius in 54 AD, and we may infer then that during the years from 49 AD, when they were expelled, to 54 AD, when they were allowed to return, the Jewish house churches in Rome had been virtually totally deprived of their Jewish leadership. Um, so during these years, then, the Christian movement in Rome would have been run almost exclusively by the Gentiles. So this is something very unique in early Christian history, because by and large you had mixed populations where it was both Jews and Gentiles. You don't have very many spots where it is primarily Gentiles who are operating and running the Christian church, but you have that in the city of Rome for at least a few years between 49 and 54 AD. Then suddenly in 54 AD, just 2 years before Paul wrote the book of Romans, the Jews were allowed to re-enter Rome. And so then there's again a dramatic shift in balance of power between the Jewish and the Gentile Christian communities. You have the Gentile Christian communities who have been running things for the last several years. Then the Jews return, expecting to have their place of authority again. So you have this tension that's arising between the Jews and the Gentiles. And all of this is occurring just 2 years before Paul wrote the letter to the church at Rome. So then that helps us to understand a bit why Paul spends so much time and effort focusing on this question of the relationship between the Jews and the Gentiles in Romans 9 through 11. It's not some circumstantial bit, it's not some sermon that was randomly inserted to the book of Romans. It's not something that we should rightly ignore and pass over. Instead, it's a very valuable and important part of Paul's goal for writing the book of Romans. In Romans, Paul lays out the gospel message as he solicits the Christians in Rome to aid him in his mission to Spain. Paul knows that there's unrest in the church between the Jews and the Gentiles, and Paul knows that his mission to Spain is an absolutely enormous task. It's arguably something bigger than anything he had ever done before, and it's going to require cooperation from the entire church. So Paul had a vision of a unified Christian church at the heart of Rome, and the unity of the Jewish and Gentile believers at this church would shine as a brilliant testimony to the capital of the empire and beyond. So we see then that Paul wanted to bring the church together. He wanted to unify the church. And so he writes the book of Romans, I believe, with that goal primarily in mind. Writing of the gospel, writing what the gospel is, writing these are the things that unite us. These are the things that bring us together. These are the things that we are to be centered on. And then writing specifically to the specific issue at the time, the divide between the Jews and the Gentiles, writing this is how that divide can be fixed. This is how that divide can be mended and healed, seeking to bring out unity so that as he goes on this mission to Spain, as he goes on to this mission of sharing the gospel to the very ends of the earth, he would have this unified force behind him, which I think is a very beautiful thing, and I think something we are continue to very much be in need of today.
If I may interject, your point about the Jews being exiled and then coming back, and 2 years later, Paul writes the letter. That may be one speculative reason, at least, why chapters 9 and through 11 is where it is, and that Paul was seeking to um, outline a divine vision of the inclusion of both Jews and Gentiles into in that picture that you just showed, into a one city of God. And I'm just sort of, that's just a thought that came to me. There's a historical, gives historical rationale for why 9 through 11 is in there.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Yeah, no, so yeah, no, I fully agree. And I think that is absolutely right on that spot on that the idea of Romans 9 through 11, many scholars will, like I say, consider it like foreign to the rest of the book of Romans. But when you see the historical context that Paul was working in, it makes sense and it fits perfectly within his overall scheme of thought of what's going on in the book of Romans. So I'm excited to, in the next few weeks, as we get closer to that, to see what he says there and what it means for his overall plan. But yeah, so now we just get to look at an outline of the book of Romans. And just before we look at the outline specific that I have chosen, there are a lot of different outlines to the book of Romans, a lot of different ways that people have outlined the book of Romans. I think in general, outlines are helpful because they allow us to have a better understanding of just the general flow of thought in any particular book that we're reading. So I think it's always helpful to kind of look at an outline of the different letters of the New Testament and the books of the Old Testament as we're beginning to read them, because it helps us gain a general picture and overview understanding before we dive in to the specifics. So this is the particular outline that I favor. I think it very clearly outlines and shows what Paul is talking about in each section. Um, this is by no means inspired or anything like this, but it's one that I find particularly helpful. So you start out with an introduction, and then Paul jumps into talking about what sin is and what our sinful situation is before talking about salvation, talking about the message of salvation and what it is that Christ did for us and how that applies to us. Then talking about sanctification and what it looks like for on a theological end, theologically, what it looks like for a follower of Christ to grow in their salvation. And then you have selection in Romans 9 1 through 11:36. And this is a section where you talk about the coming together of the Jews and the Gentiles, which I think, as we'll get there in a few weeks, I think has very particular and very specific implications for the book of Romans. And again, what Paul is trying to accomplish, and particular hope for this message of Christianity and what all of this means to Christianity and the gospel message. I believe it all ties together very well. And then Romans 12 through the first half of 15 describe the service or the application of the theology. So you have the first 11 chapters. Paul is simply outlining theology. He's outlining what the gospel is and what it means. And then in Romans 12 through 15, he describes, okay, now that we've talked about this, this is what it means. This is how we ought to live. This is what our lives ought to look like. And then he concludes the book of Romans in the last half of 15 and chapter 16. And essentially, that's going to be the outline that we follow for this course. Next week, we're going to be talking about the sin section. And then over the course of the next several weeks, we'll be talking about each of these sections in turn. The final week together, we'll be talking about the service section and the conclusion together. But that gives you an idea of where we are going over the next few weeks. And then just want to finally highlight this verse, these two verses, Romans 1, 16 through 17. These, in many regards, these are the key verses for the book of Romans. These are the theme verses for the book of Romans. It's how Paul concludes his introduction before he jumps into the sin section. And this, uh, I think, shows what he's going to be talking about in the book of Romans. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. So I think those are incredibly valuable verses to consider, to know, to understand that this is what Paul's going to be talking about for the next 16 chapters. So buckle up because it's going to be a fun time. So that is our introduction in this first section, first session. Like I say, I have recorded this session and will be publishing that recording so others who have signed up for the course and others can view the recording.